think I speak for everyone. Wow, this is loud. Can you hear me okay? When I say wow, right? I want to introduce myself. My name is Kimberly Bookman. I'm a reporter with 7 News here in Boston, and I'm going to be moderating the panel here today. We have some distinguished guests with us. You can see their bios in the program that you got, but I will introduce them briefly, and then we'll just dig right in. Give us a second to get these microphones in order. Hold on just a moment. And I guess we'll just pass the microphones down. Is that okay? Okay. So let me introduce the guests here. We start with Stephanie Brown. Stephanie is the CEO of Casa Myrna, Boston's largest provider of domestic violence services. We have Alejandra St.Guillen, did I pronounce that right? The director of the Mayor's Office for Immigrant Advancement, helping immigrants participate in city life. Dave Rini, who is the manager of prison inmate safety for the Boston Area Rape Center. And Erin Moulton, who is the author of the book Things We Haven't Said, Accounts from Survivors of Child and Teen Sex Abuse. Thank you all for being here. So my first question is, we saw the text here of an actual trial that happened in Israel in 2008. It is now 10 years later in the United States, in the Me Too movement. Have things changed? Would we see this kind of treatment of victims in a court of law?
I would say in some courts of law, yes. I think, but what's more telling is everything that the survivor was saying are things that we hear every day from survivors, whether it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, or yesterday. So sort of the humiliation, not wanting to tell anybody, being frozen, all of those are completely common reactions to sexual assault and to domestic violence. So I think that what we heard, I'm sorry, I'm still sort of reeling from I was like, was that a comedy or was that real? That's not possible. And yet I think it's such an important thing for us to hear because it was real, and it is real. And I think it's really important for us to remember that and to see that and sort of be witness to that. Because we can, in the Me Too movement, we can say that things are getting better and survivors can speak out and people are listening and perpetrators are being punished, and yet this kind of thing happens every single day. So I think it's a really important perspective for us to have.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, and I think with the Me Too movement, there's a lot of coming out. There's a lot of people with the support of their communities around them saying what they've been through. What there isn't is this greater, deeper understanding of what the impacts and the effects of that are. I think we saw that all with the Kavanaugh hearing, and just, well, why didn't she remember, and why didn't she come forward, and why, and then even with the laughing, that I don't know if that struck anybody else, but I remember the doctor's testimony. The thing that really struck me the most is that what she could remember is the laughter. And I think with the Me Too movement, I think what you will have is perhaps in the United States, because it's a different system in Israel, but say it's in the United States, a jury that might be more apt to believe, right, that someone coming forward, but still might not have this deeper understanding of the not remembering, of being frozen, of people, if you haven't been through it, just those seem like unnatural reactions to someone going through a trauma.
Anything you'd like to add?
Anything I'd like to add? There are so many notes on my paper. So we're talking about the relevancy of this, right? And I think one of the things that was standing out to me was how she was kept being asked, why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you come forward? And one of the things she kept saying was she wasn't sure if he would believe, which we've touched on. But one thing that wasn't exactly in the script that kept resonating with me working with juveniles was that she had first to tell her parents. That was her first step. Because we have to remember that children are dependent, right? And so there's all these things that lead up to a trial even that we might be detecting that maybe somebody else wouldn't. But the first step is to be able to even say something aloud to your parents. Then after that, you have to have parents who care, right? Because you're depending on them. And a lot of people, especially with children, when perpetrators, the primary perpetrators of juvenile sexual violence is adults in their life. This one didn't happen to be, but then you have to have, the adults who care and the adults who know what to do. So adults who are educated to go to to report, how to find the police and make the next move. And this whole time she's this dependent. So when we're looking at kids who are struggling with any sort of sexual violence, they're relying on somebody. Very rarely do they have any know-how of how to find help or get resources. That's what was really resonating with me. If you want to.
I mean, it's probably, I imagine, most of our hopes that this sort of thing isn't happening right now, but I would bet more money than not that if you went to any of our district courts in Boston, that something like this, hopefully a little bit better, but like this, is going to happen tomorrow. I did a little bit of work getting restraining orders for folks who are in domestic violence situations, and things were not that different, and that was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So it's not that different now. Maybe the language is a little different, and maybe Me Too has changed the way that legal officials might ask certain questions, but it's the same ideas. And law moves really slowly, and it's still populated primarily by old white dudes who are maybe not the demographic that is best placed to respond with the right kind of sympathy or the right kind of empathy in these situations.
I'm going to kind of piggyback off of what you said, that this is happening in court systems across Boston and the United States all the time. What was interesting about what we saw today is that in Israel, when this case happened, the victim was a woman. All of those attorneys, the judges, were men. They swapped that for this play today. Do you think that by swapping that, you kind of see that there is the way that men and women are treated is different? That a male victim may have been treated differently than a female victim? Certainly we don't see in courts here for anyone to have to demonstrate how they were sexually assaulted. Do you think that there would be different sets of questions depending on who the gender of the victim and who's asking these questions and the judges who are judging them? You're talking about, white dudes being the judges.
If I could jump in real quick. So I think there's two really interesting and really scary and sad sort of realities. So the first is, I think the answer to that is absolutely yes, because if you remember, there's a lot of this sort of question about how is she supposed to be reacting? How is she supposed to be manifesting the trauma that came across to her? There's a really sort of long and pernicious history about what a perfect victim looks like, and that we expect, especially women, to sort of evidence a certain kind of behavior to indicate that they've been through distress. And we know that in reality, survivors process trauma in 1,000 different ways and may not look at all like that, but the cultural story is still, this is how especially women are going to respond. And I don't think men get that same response. But the thing that's similar, and that I think is something we should all think about, in my program at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, I work with incarcerated survivors. The vast majority of the folks I work with are men. And the types of reactions that anyone who goes through trauma, the fear of not being believed, the nightmares, the shame, that stuff is almost universal. Again, the way it manifests in people's behavior is different, but the way that men experience trauma is pretty much the same, which is an interesting sort of truth, that the folks that have to go through this kind of stuff are oftentimes facing the same obstacles, but culture doesn't treat them that way. It treats them as if they're sort of totally different species, and we expect vastly different responses from them, which is oftentimes not fair.
Anyone like to add anything? You're talking a little bit about your organization and who some of the clients are that you serve. We were all talking about how relevant this still seems, even though this happened 10 years ago today. Can you talk about some of the things that you're seeing, how you make this relevant to what you're dealing with on a daily basis? And also, I'm curious as to what we aren't hearing that is out there and that people are dealing with.
So, one thing that really struck me was this whole idea of language. So, the victim in this case, and the language difference being not actual, language, but the actual language, the legal language, right? So the level of comfort that one has within a courtroom, and just, it really struck me that the victim, and the defendant also obviously, but the victim is the only one who's not used to that language every single day and what that impact. And I don't know if I felt it more because it was a man that was playing the role. I'm still processing how that made me feel different. I still hated the defense attorney, right? I mean, I thought I would hate her less because she was a woman, and I still really, really hated her. So good job. Actors did an amazing job. But I think of that often because, you know, in immigration court, it's very different. It's not a criminal court, it's a civil court, so you don't have a right to, you have a right to attorney, but one's not afforded to you if you can't afford one. And so, you know, a lot of these cases, in this type of case wouldn't be heard in that type of setting, but for victims of assault or violence, there are certain visas that they can apply for in order to, based on what they've been through, to be able to stay in and to path to a green card. But there's so much that you have to go through. You have to relive the trauma. You have to go to a court of law. You have to, and then the language, the actual language, so not just the legal language, but then having everything translated and then translated back. You know, I just kept thinking, wow, I wonder if they were speaking actual different languages, then how much further that separates you from what's going on, and how, I mean, just how difficult it is to come forward, even when you have been the victim. And even if, you know, and you say in a court of law, you have, you know, if you have an attorney, or, you know, that you will be believed and you'll be able to say your case. But I just think it's, I mean, for me, just watching it out here just really reiterated to me. I just kept thinking language, and just how separated the victim is from the language of the courtroom.
Can I piggyback off that? Because when we're talking about juveniles, again, they're forming language, right? So in my book, it was kids from the ages of 4 to 19. And so obviously a 4-year-old's not going to know what's going on. And oftentimes, you know, in incest, which we don't hear a lot about, you asked what do we not hear a lot about, in an incest environment, there's this normalizing of the behavior, so that, and in a lot of these scenarios, right, so the child, this is just their normal, and they're going along. And then there's this lack of education at school, which is a problem. And this is what I want more of the conversation to go toward, is where is our robust anti-sexual violence education in all public schools? Because if primary perpetrators of juvenile sexual violence are adults in the child's life, so that's normalized at home, and then we have it stigmatized at school, right? So there is a disconnect here, where a child won't have an education about it and won't be able to seek help unless they stumble upon it, is basically what we find out, whether it's on the internet or in a book, or one of the writers found something in To Kill a Mockingbird. That's when she realized, it was many, many years later. She was 6, she read it when she was 12. She said, wait a minute, okay, I was right, like that. All these things started to connect. So that's where I'd like to see more conversation, is about what can a public school do to educate kids about this topic. And I want it like universal. That's what I want to see across public educational systems.
And I'm going to go down the line and ask you all to kind of answer that question. I think that especially in the news media, you know, we sit through a court case like this, 8 hours of testimony, and then you see a minute and a half on TV, kind of giving you the highlight reel of what actually happened, and we're missing a lot of the details. What were some of the important things that we're missing, that we're not hearing about in the news media, and we need to be?
I think one of the things, and it's a very small thing, but I think when you do our work, we pick up on all the really little small things. And one of the ones was when she was being cross-examined, and they said, well, what did you want your parents to do when you said that's not all? And she couldn't really answer it, and they were like, but what did your parents do? Did they ask you more? And she said no. So I think she was hoping that they would ask more so that she could disclose, or she'd have the opportunity to say something, and they didn't ask. And I think that's what we see in domestic violence and in sexual assault. People are afraid to ask because you don't want to know the answer.
It might sound kind of strange to say in lieu of or in light of Me Too being the social movement that it's been for the past year, but one of the things that I think, even still, we sort of as a culture sort of really have a hard time reckoning with is the scale of what we're talking about. There's a fantastic book called Yes Means Yes that was edited by Jacqueline Friedman and Jessica Valenti. It's one of my sort of the books that got me into this work, and I'm trying to remember the exact piece within the book, but there's a line about someone who's been through some of the sort of sexual harassment sort of stuff in her life, and it was a very day-to-day moment. And there's a line, something to the extent of, if we ever really understood the scale of how many people have been through this, it would feel like the world was opening up and swallowing us all whole. And I think that what this show did particularly well and really painfully was it really highlighted the importance of power and control, and that sort of dominance is really at the root of sexual violence, and a whole lot of other types of violence too. But that so many people have been through this, and so many of us are in spaces in our world where, honestly, thinking about the world that way is really destabilizing and hard to do. And that's been one of the issues of the Me Too sort of pushback is most of us probably know a huge number of survivors, but that also means we know a huge number of perpetrators.
But it's hard to talk about the perpetrators because they are the people that you know, and they too have been victims. So it's a much longer discussion, but I think it's something that would be worth having.
You know, we watch something like we watched today, and you feel for the victim, right? But you see the defense attorney get up and say, "Hey, men, come stand up and show your stature and how tall you are." And then you hear the victim say, "I was in the police cruiser and they were in the back seat." Everyone deserves a fair trial. We know we have a legal system for a reason. We want to show compassion to the victim, and yet the suspects also deserve to have that same right to pursue their innocence. How do we fix the system so that everyone gets a fair shake, and yet we are still protecting those who haven't been protected? I mean, I think it's kind of, Dave, I'm looking at you specifically because you work with inmates in the prison system, so there's sort of some relevance to what I'm talking about with you. But everyone, please jump in.
That's a big question, and I think it really comes down to two things. So the first thing is we have to actually want to fix it. And I'll give a tiny sort of analogy here, so bear with me for a minute. The Prison Rape Elimination Act, which is the federal law that sort of requires prisons and jails to allow people like me to do my job, mandates all kinds of special reporting features for inmates when they've been assaulted, how they can tell the facility what's going on. The second challenge, which is certainly not small, a very big picture, is we don't have a great way of doing something that's not all or nothing. So like we saw in this transcript here in the show, the option is either you are guilty of a horrific crime or you didn't do anything. And I know that we say very clearly, not guilty doesn't mean you're innocent, but feasibly that's what it means to jurors, I think, a lot of times. And there's nothing in between. We don't have any options for restorative justice. We don't have any options for some other kind of reparation. And that's one of our challenges, because a lot of these situations are going to be complicated, and they're going to require a certain amount of empathy, and they're going to require a certain amount of understanding of sort of the pattern that sexual violence tends to take. And our legal system is not super well set up to determine things that are murky right now. I don't think that's what it focuses on.
Thank you. I know that we're going to try and wrap up, so I'm going to ask all of us to go down the line. I'll start with you, Erin, just with what do we take away from here? Where do we go from here in improving, the way that we deal with victims and our compassion towards them, the legal system, what we need to publicize, whatever you want to say as we move forward. What's the takeaway, if you will?
So the takeaway for me was really interesting because I'm watching the show and I'm starting to hear people around me's reactions. So it's like the deep breath starts. It's like everybody's trying to do the soothing breath because it's so uncomfortable, and then we get a little angry and then we laugh with a little tension when the tension breaks. So, and what I was noticing was, okay, that's where we're digging deep, and that's where we're now seeing context. And everybody's sitting in this discomfort for a minute, for an hour, and we're in it, and we're all feeling it, but it's okay. Like no one got up and ran, right? So that's the takeaway, is that hashtags are great for spreading news, but they don't replace context and complexity, which is what we need to sit with. And we need to sit with the discomfort of all these conversations in their depth. That's my takeaway.
I was going to say empathy. I was going to say, really looking in the political climate that we're in across all topics, there really is just such a lack of empathy, which makes it so easy to hate the other, right? And so, I thought one of the things that I thought when I first heard of the play, and that they would be changing gender roles but not the pronouns, I thought that was really fascinating to me, because it really forces a level of empathy, I think, through the person who's reading the part. And I 100% agree. It's sitting with the discomfort and talking about that and trying to get through the complexities of these issues is definitely something I'll take away.
I think the two ones that I'll leave here with, first, support the survivors in your life. You may not know how many survivors there are in your life, but that's where having things like information about Casa Myrna or about BARC or about the other support services can be valuable. Glad to hear that in this show, we're a pernicious influence on changing evidence. So that's one really basic, easy one. Grab a magnet, slap it on your fridge. It may mean that someone that didn't know if they could trust you to talk to you about it might see that and decide that they can, and that's real. And the second one, and this is a much sort of bigger, more confusing one, but the fact that this was an Israeli court trial, and that this was 10 years ago, and yet it has so many similarities and probably felt pretty topical to so many of us, means that you've got two different legal systems, two different cultures, two different languages, one similar problem. That doesn't happen by accident. What is the power structure that exists such that multiple cultures have this same problem and are dealing with the same issue, right? That means it's not just a weird idiosyncratic thing that happens in this. This happens to all of us. And so that big takeaway is, how are we supporting that power structure? We're all doing it a little tiny bit inadvertently, and are there ways that we can take little hatchets to the logs that keep that up? Because if we can, then maybe we stop seeing that, and it starts being a lot more confusing to us because we're not used to seeing that kind of stuff anymore. But that's long work. It's a lot longer than 1 year of a hashtag. That's decades long stuff.
I think one of the things I want to make sure that everyone recognizes too is that the system there need to be multiple systems and multiple ways for survivors to be able to speak out and to get justice however they define it for themselves. Most survivors don't want to get engaged in the criminal justice system. They want nothing to do with it, in part because it doesn't work well, but they often just don't even want to participate in that. And so I think there have to be other ways for survivors to get justice and to be safe and to be able to speak out. And doing it without judgment and without shame. And I think one of those ways is for having productions like this and bringing it forward and having people talk about it. The fact that almost everybody who was here to watch it actually stayed and is part of this discussion, I think that's really telling and it's really important. And I think that just that to me says, okay, we're going a step further. And every day it'll be a little bit further and a little bit further. But I think just for us to recognize that, we have to have empathy and that we have to create multiple ways for survivors to be able to speak their truth and get justice the way they need it.
And on that note, if you haven't been talking about these issues, consider this a jumping off point to start talking about these issues. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our panel. I think Guy had said earlier that we're going to go outside for a drink to celebrate Israeli Stage's anniversary. We can continue to talk and answer questions. Thanks again for being here. Bye.